Hello and welcome to our second lesson on dealing with document-based questions. In this second lesson, we're going to talk about how to assess reliability of a source. We've already looked at how to distinguish whether a source is a primary or secondary source. And now we're going to talk a little bit about what is reliability and why is it important. First of all, what is reliability? Reliability is a term used to describe how accurate a source is. Does this information provided by a source give a true account or true representation of an event or topic? Reliability helps us decide how to use a source. That's why reliability is important. We will use a reliable source and a non-reliable source differently. It's important to remember that once you've assessed reliability, even if you think a source is not that reliable, it might still have a place in your research or in your writing. You might still like to analyze it and discuss it. It's just that an unreliable source or a less reliable source won't be a main source that we use to draw conclusions from and get our information from. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the factors that help us examine reliability. So reliability depends on attribution, corroboration, information provided or not provided, and the type of image or the type of document, the type of source. Attribution. What is attribution? Attribution refers to who said it, who wrote it, who created it. So the author or the creator, and who they might be affiliated with. So who said it and who are they? Throughout history, people have fallen on different sides of an issue, for example, or they might be from different political spheres, and recognizing who they are and what their interests might be is really important when we look at the information that we're getting from that source. The perspective of the author can influence how information is perceived or portrayed. People on different sides of an issue will have different perspectives. What bias or point of view does this create? Well, bias refers to being inclined to hold a partial perspective. In other words, to give an argument that is one-sided, okay, or give information that only shows one side of a topic or of an issue. Bias can be identified if the author outwardly supports or denounces something or someone. So sometimes you'll be reading something and it's quite obvious that there is some bias, that the author has bias. An account that leaves out facts or information or only presents facts that support one side of an issue is considered to be biased. And when we're looking in Social Studies 10, there's many different types of documents that you might be looking at. It might be secondary sources such as websites, the textbook, excerpts from a book, as well as quotes that we're reading, primary source quotes in this course. And we want to be asking ourselves, who wrote it? What might be their perspective? Where were they at the time of the event? And who were they affiliated with? And how can that influence the information that is in that document? An example of attribution or example of bias might be a political speech. For example, if we're listening to a political speech during an election, the candidate might want to condemn the decisions or policies of another leader. Okay, they might want to make their competition look bad. And when discussing the policy, they might only present negative facts and statistics. By focusing on the downside of the policy, they might persuade the audience to see the competing candidate in a poor light and therefore win the support of the audience. So it's important for us to be critical thinkers to be able to identify attribution and consider the perspective of the speaker or the author or the artist when we're looking at a source, and identify bias. Here's another example of attribution. Let's say I want to find out more about the Northern Gateway pipeline. So I look it up on the internet and the first thing I Google is the company's website. So imagine that I use the company's website as a source to get my information about the Northern Gateway pipeline. Well, I need to consider that the company supports the pipeline. So the creators of this website and the authors of the information on the website are affiliated with the company who is creating the Northern Gateway Pipeline and will support it. So attribution is important here. The facts might be presented in a way that persuade me to support it, and I need to be aware of possible bias. For example, when I'm reading about the environmental risks of the pipeline, the website might minimize the environmental risks. When I might read a different article in a newspaper that is critiquing the Northern Gateway Pipeline, and I might read some very different information that highlights some of the environmental hazards that are associated with building the pipeline. So again, it's important, and when I read a different article, it's important for me to think about who wrote that article, what would their perspective be, okay, so that I'm aware of the information that I'm getting. It's also a good idea when you look at any source to not just simply look at one source, but to investigate other sources, and which we're going to get to next. So corroboration refers to comparing different sources to see if they say the same thing. If one resource says something very different from another, then those two sources do not corroborate. Sources that corroborate create or promote reliability, and in a similar way, sources that do not corroborate dispute reliability. If I look at 4 different sources and 3 of them say this very similar information and one of them gives very different information, I would say that that 4th source does not corroborate and is less reliable than my other sources. But in order to determine reliability, one of the things we need to do is look at a variety of different sources and look for corroboration. Some examples of corroboration: police officers or police investigators use corroboration in their daily work. They might interview witnesses separately to see if everyone has a similar story or can recount an incident the same way. And if so, they would say these stories corroborate, and the police may determine that the account of the incident is reliable. In social studies, if I read an account of an event from a secondary source, such as a book or a textbook, I should search for one or more other resources, hopefully a few more resources, to see if they corroborate. If I find 3 other sources with very different accounts, the first one I read may not be reliable. Whether or not information is provided or not also helps us assess reliability. When we're looking at a document, we want to check for the name. If the name of the author is not provided, it's very difficult for me to assess, for me to decide what the perspective of that author would have been if I don't know who they are. So it's hard to check for attribution if we don't know who wrote it. The date, when was it written? This is important. If it was written right at the time of an event, maybe it's a primary source. It might be difficult to determine whether it's a primary source when there's no date there. Is the information still valid? That's important too. In history, if we're reading something that was written much later, that's helpful to us because we know that it's a secondary source. And in science, for example, we might be looking at an article written 50 years ago, and we would want to question whether that information is still valid because science has evolved and changed since then. Location is important. Where was it written? Was a person in Ottawa writing about an event that occurred in BC? If so, that could affect the reliability of it. Okay, that might not be a primary source document, and I might like to find another document that was written, a primary source document that was written in BC at the time of the event. If information is missing, the name, date, or location, this can dispute reliability because we're not able to critically analyze either attribution, the author's perspective, the time lapse between the event and the creation of the document, or whether the author was present at the event, or whether they were geographically removed. Finally, the type of source is important when we're looking at reliability. When looking at an image, the type is important. For example, a photograph versus a drawing versus a painting. Generally, a photograph is most reliable, unless, of course, it's a photograph that's been staged. Most photographs that we look at give us a first-hand account of what things look like at that time. And photographs are primary sources, as are drawings or paintings that were created at that time. But a photograph is a real-life image and is usually more reliable. We should also consider the artist. Where were they at the time of the event? If looking at a drawing, was the artist there, or were they analyzing other primary sources and then creating something, so that art might be then a secondary source. So it is important to think about who the creator is as well. A recorded video of an event would be more reliable than a reenactment. The recorded video would be live footage, it's a primary source. A reenactment would be a secondary source. So the primary source is generally most reliable, although there are many very reliable secondary sources, such as the textbook that we use in Social Studies 10. But all of these factors are ones that we need to consider. So attribution, corroboration, the type of document, and the type of source. And we'll look at it as an example here. So, for example, we've got a photograph of a family returning home after being in a relocation center after World War II. So this is a Japanese American family returning home after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor at a time when there was much discrimination against Japanese Americans. We can see from this picture by the discriminatory graffiti on their house. Just in one picture alone, we get a really good understanding of what kind of discrimination that family would have experienced. So this photograph would be more reliable than a drawing, for example, of the same scene. So the type of source is very important in assessing reliability.